EGR cooler coolant flow begins from the water pump dual outlet. The external tube provides a high-volume flow to the EGR cooler. Of the water pump capacity, 78% of the flow is directed through this tube. The remaining 22% of the coolant flow out of the water pump is directed to the block as in other ISX engines. Coolant from the water pump dual outlet enters the EGR cooler at the base of the cooler and travels parallel with the exhaust flow in order to provide maximum cooling. Once the coolant reaches the end of the EGR cooler, it flows out the bottom of the cooler down to the oil cooler cavity. The EGR cooler contains a coolant vent line at the top of it in order to vent air out of the cooler coolant system. The line travels from the EGR cooler to the thermostat housing. Coolant flows from the oil cooler cavity up to the variable geometry turbocharger, providing the required cooling for the VGT mechanism and bearing housing. From the VGT, coolant flows to the thermostat housing. The VGT actuator receives coolant from the same source as the VGT. Coolant is circulated through the actuator to maintain the temperature suitable for the electronic controls in the actuators. Once the coolant has traveled through the actuator, it flows to the thermostat housing. Coolant flow for the aftertreatment injector begins at the EGR cooler. The coolant flows down to the aftertreatment injector. Once the coolant enters the aftertreatment injector, it flows around the injector and through an outlet on the other side. The coolant leaves the aftertreatment injector and travels down to the oil cooler housing. Coolant pressure in the EGR cooler is higher than that of the oil cooler housing, which provides the necessary flow. The coolant port toward the middle of the engine block provides pressurized coolant flow to the air compressor. This flow comes from the water jacket in the block. The connection in the block near the gear housing provides coolant flow from the air compressor. This port connects to the coolant bypass passage. Since the bypass passage is directly connected to the inlet side of the water pump, this area has a low coolant pressure. The pressure differential between the coolant in the block and the coolant in the bypass passage causes coolant to flow through the air compressor.